charging block for my laptop. It was up there a second ago. Yeah. Oh, block right here. See? Okay. Emphasis aren't typically. Yeah, they on this. Well, they don't pick up. They don't actually. Yeah.
Folks, I'm sharing one of the handouts for the presentation right now. The other one does not have a handout, so this is all we've got. This is for Leondre McBride's presentation. It's in the chat.
Yes. Yes. You know, especially I would
I mean, that is a place to be for us.
Want to be close to the next slide.
Oh, yeah, those slides are very unique.
Yeah.
Love you. Yeah. They come fly at you like, what? Where are you? Yeah. What do you wear? And how much do you wear? Way.
We have a full front row of seats right here. Looks like everyone's settled though. All right.
I guess I suppose it's altered today. I like to get that. Well, especially if you slide it. Look like I'm sitting here. Yeah, just channeling here.
Good evening, everybody.
Evening.
At the philosophy party tonight.
Woo! Woo!
I will awkwardly embarrass everybody on Zoom just because I want them to see you all here. Hey. My name is Nathan Carson, Program Director of Philosophy at Franklin Pacific University. And it is my great honor and pleasure to share with you an evening of conversation tonight with two of our outstanding philosophers here at FPU, Leondre McBride and Nicholas Portwood. We also have the delight and surprise new addition for after the philosopher talks are done. Christian Barrio will be giving a talk on the library in Alexandria, a historical presentation. So if any of you want to stay after for the third wave, Christian is awesome as well. Philosophy as a discipline is central to the university mission and identity for a reason. It embodies not only the history of the university and its reason and purpose for existing, but it embodies at this place, at a place like FPU, faith-seeking understanding in the most fundamental and I think cross-pollinating sense in a way that sort of leavens the identity of the whole place. And since we have a particularly tall presenter tonight, I will note that one of the chief philosophers in history that tried to engage in fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding, Thomas Aquinas, 4 of his 5 volumes of the Summa Theologiae are propping up our lecture tonight.
I find that very ironic, because usually it's philosophy propping up theology.
So that is for Leondre, so the podium can be higher, but I also thought it was quite appropriate, given the recent news that FU is deciding to shutter the philosophy program. So thank you for tonight. Thank you for your support. That decision is under review, and all of your voices matter. In fact, just today, not that long ago, 12, 13, 14, some odd students walked in and had a large meeting with the president, and he listened very well and very carefully.
He took notes.
He took notes, and we have a lot of faith in him as a president and in this situation. So thank you for being here. Tonight, as an illustration, in a sense, an embodiment of the centrality of philosophy in this place, we will be touching upon philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of physics, philosophy of race, ethics, I believe aesthetics as well, and political theory. So there are a lot of ways in which these 2 talks tonight in philosophy, with the great value addition and insight and history presentation, will demonstrate what it is that we do and why. And I'm so proud of Nick and Leondre for their work, and Christian as well. All 3 of us have spent time also in the Fresno Pacific University Sierra program. So we have spent a lot of hours and days together, and I'm so proud of all 3 of you for this time. Thank you for coming. First up will be Leondre McBride, presenting a paper on moral responsibility and agency in the Black American community. Please welcome Leondre McBride.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I absolutely hate public speaking with passion. The good news is that more of you came than I thought, so now I'm really nervous. I'll be speaking about my paper topic titled Moral Agency of Responsibility and the Black American Community, the Case for Autonomous Conservatism. Over 2 centuries ago, the Negro was ripped from his homeland in Africa, taken from the hands of African slavers, stuffed into ships, assuming they weren't part of the millions who died along the journey, and sent to New Worlds. From that moment on, the Negroes categorically have suffered large-scale disenfranchisement, enslavement, lynchings, segregation, forced sterilization, hate crimes called less than human, and forced to breed like bovine livestock. Even the most basic rights enjoyed, such as reading, writing, dining, looking at a woman, or practicing Christianity, could get a Black person maimed or killed. Indeed, countless narratives from the slave or Jim Crow era could be cited here, showing the rank barbarism faced by American Blacks since they experienced their own existential thrownness into a foreign and hostile land, being enframed in the Heideggerian sense, seen only to be as valuable as that which they could produce economically for landowning whites. This story is probably familiar to us all. We've all heard it. We've probably all seen every single slave movie that's been introduced in theaters, all 2,000 of them or so in the last 10 years. It itself is a tale as old as time. We all know what happened to the Negro and how he got here to the United States. We know about slavery, we know about the injustice. We also know about the oppression. And this wasn't lost on the people of the past either. When the Emancipation Proclamation came down, well-meaning people asked, what shall we do with the Negro? There was a good reason for asking, considering that you just took a group of people from across the world, transported them here, abused them, deprived them of an education, and restricted them from learning. So now what? That's the question. And today we aren't asking anything different than the same, what shall we do with the Negro question from 1862. Today, the question is really important because it has political implications. Everyone wants to know, what are you going to do for us Black Americans, Mr. Prospective Politician? And we usually get a host of answers back. Should we focus on fixing white America first? Would that somehow fix Black issues? Do Black Americans refer to themselves as kings or queens? In 1988, the Reverend Jesse Jackson proposed that Black should be referred to as African American in order to give us a connection back to our original homeland. Apparently, this was supposed to fix something. Many people believe that what we need in Black America is to have more Disney princesses who are Black. It's funny, but they're serious. Or what we really need in Black America is more political representation, maybe a Black president, for example. Some groups, such as the Nation of Islam, believe that Blacks need to have their own separate country. All of these solutions, if I might, seem to be missing the point. They all seem to assume that the solutions to Black problems are somehow outside of the Black community. But what are the real issues that we face? While the constant bickering has continued related to fixing some issues going on in Black America, especially inner city Black America, we've continued to suffer and die. Little is known of the actual plight of the inner city Black American who is surrounded by people with a similar phenotypic expression. Many of the issues that we face they're either ignored, underreported, or removed from public discourse entirely. Who are the most revered people in the inner city Black community? Would it surprise you if I told you it was a drug dealer? What if I told you that the killer, yes, I mean a murderer, is the most respected person in the inner city in their entire community? What if I told you that completing a stay in a penitentiary was a badge of honor and that it earned you bragging rights in your local neighborhood? Do you know that studies have been done showing that Black students in these communities face a major social cost for being too smart because academic success is often believed to be acting white? Do you know that African-American youth lose friends for having too high of a GPA? Or what about our mass shooting problems? Do you know that they happen at our house parties? I'm not talking about in schools, but they happen at our house parties fairly often. Or are our victims not as important because the person who killed them didn't have the right complexion? Do we mean less if our killer is not a police officer? What if I told you that from our youth, we were taught by the people in authority to never cooperate with the police? And so what if I told you as a result that a 15-year-old girl was gang raped in front of dozens of witnesses who failed to intervene or report the crime because they didn't want to be branded as snitches? Or what if I told you that the gas station has a different place in the mind of an inner city Black American? Or what's the protocol when you need gas, but the nearest one is dominated by a certain gang? How long is too long to make eye contact with another person who looks just like you? Do you speak? Do you not speak? Or you're at a stoplight and the car that pulled up next to you has 4 people inside who look just like you. Have you left sufficient room in front of you to escape in case they lower their windows? Or if they ask you where you're from or what size shoes you're wearing, what if I told you that those are not innocent questions, but they made your heart beat faster because you know that you might not make it out of this situation alive? What if I told you that many people don't see a point in trying to do anything better with their lives because they believe that they're victims of a rigged system and there's actually no point in trying? How would you motivate such a person given that mindset? Trying to figure out how to make changes is exhausting, and some people have given up entirely. Even the rapper Kendrick Lamar shares this feeling in one song. He says, "I refuse to be a statistic, but changing my community doesn't seem realistic. If you show me an African American doing right, I'll show you one who will kill his ass tonight." And this is what motivated the project for me. Trying to find solutions for these real issues that are faced every single day by the Black American stuck in this sort of thinking. Trying to find out why and what motivates people in my area, people who look like me, to engage in these sorts of activities that don't result in success and also depart from morality. So what's the solution, you ask? I have 5 premises leading to a conclusion, which I've laid out, you'll find them there in the outline. My first premise is that moral agency and personal responsibility are necessary for self-actualization, praise, and blame. Second premise, if moral agency and personal responsibility are required for self-actualization, praise, and blame, then it is necessary to identify the sources that undermine moral agency and personal responsibility, sources of good for human beings, and to pursue the best path for maximizing these goods. Third premise is that we must identify sources which undermine these goods for human beings and pursue the best path for maximizing them. Fourth premise, any solution to Black American issues, if the solution undercuts moral agency and personal responsibility, there are strong reasons to reject it. And if a solution enhances moral agency and personal responsibility, there are good reasons to adopt that solution. Premise 5. Conservatism offers solutions which enhance moral agency and personal responsibility. And my conclusion, therefore, Black Americans should adopt conservatism. My first premise goes as follows. The first task is to establish that such a moral agent exists in the first place. What do I mean by a moral agent? A moral agent is one who gains a moral sense through some means, meaning he or she has an understanding of right and wrong, and that this moral sense is somehow informed. The principal ways in which a moral agent gains a moral sense are through the passions, meaning their feelings, and through rationality, such as learning. I argue here that the moral sense of a moral agent is gained via both means. For the passions, the moral sense is informed by the feelings of praise or blame within a community. That is, you're motivated to do X rather than Y, because X comes with praise, while Y comes with blame and ridicule. Agents typically govern themselves in such a way that they will receive praise from a community rather than blame. For rationality, I argue that moral agents can likewise be informed in the moral sense by information. You can learn that doing X is wrong because you were told of it and the consequences. A person can speak with you and inform you of the harm involved in some situation, or that such an act of X might result in a less than desirable outcome. As a result of that information, a moral agent will often govern themselves accordingly, unless there's some agent apparent reason not to. These community values, which inform the moral sense, govern how an agent behaves. Consequently, this ability to govern oneself in accordance with his or her passions and rationality makes that person a moral agent. So to recap, the moral sense is gained through the passions and rationality. The passions are generally informed by feelings of praise or blame within a community. Rationality can be informed by education and information. Community values often inform how an agent behaves, and the ability to govern oneself in accordance with the passions of rationality makes one a moral agent. Second part of the thing. Moral agents have actions that are attributable to them and to which they are accountable. The next step is to establish that the actions of these moral agents leave them open to accountability. For any act that an agent engages in, which accords with their passions and rationality, such an action can be moral or immoral, right or wrong. That is, a moral agent can engage in an activity that falls short of morality and our moral knowledge. The agent who acted in such a way made a meaningful choice in their time in accordance with their passions and rationality. The fact that the agent chose to do X rather than Y means that the agent who acted has committed an act that is more than just attributable to them, but that agent is responsible for the act that they committed. Each time, the agent made a conscious choice to engage in some act for their own reasons. They are open to praise or blame for such an act. For every act which involves engagement that is informed by the passions or rationality, the agent is therefore accountable. Even if the story of determinism is true and the world were completely fixed in such a way that the agent's choices are limited, the agent still made conscious choices in the time that they acted, which informed how they behaved. In that agent's every informed activity, the agent knowingly decided to do X rather than Y for reasons that were readily apparent to the agent in question. So to recap, actions that an agent engages in can fall short of morality. The agent made a meaningful choice to act in ways that either meets or falls short of morality. This is more than just attribution or causality, but an agent is responsible when they act for their own reasons. And that this is compatible even with determinism, since agents act for their own purposes, thus making them responsible for their actions. Next, any agent who can receive praise must necessarily be worthy of blame. Now, this next section here is where things get a bit controversial in our present context. Here, I argue that it is contradictory, hypocritical, and meaningless to praise an agent who you do not believe is capable of blame. Because praise suggests that the way that an agent behaved could have been otherwise. It could have otherwise been different, and that an observer can offer opinions about the act that the agent in question has engaged in. So, when an observer sees an agent and sees that the agent in question has done X, the observer takes account of the activity. After assessing the action, its results, or both, the observer checks the activity against some conceptual desired outcome. After the observer of the agent's act has made an assessment, the observer offers praise if he or she finds the action accords well with a conceptual desired outcome. To give an example, let's think about Black History Month. Black History Month is a federal holiday where the entire country observes the achievement of Black American figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., W.B. Du Bois, Benjamin Banneker, Frederick Douglass, Rosa Parks, Booker T. Washington, so on and so forth. When we, as observers, take into account the actions these men and women undertook, we use our concepts of right and wrong to judge their actions. After thinking through the lives of these people, their particular context, and the state of the nation, we praise them for what they've done. And I personally think this is a good thing. However, many well-meaning people will refuse to employ the same tactic if the result of the observation and assessment leaves Black Americans open to blame. For example, think back to the George Floyd demonstrations that took place across the country. Communities in over 20 states burned in the single most destructive riot in this nation's history. Apartment buildings burned, which housed Black residents. Black men were gunned down in the streets by other Black men who were trying to rob a jewelry store. Target pharmacies where Black residents got their prescriptions filled were burned down to the ground. Voices of Black leaders, such as NAACP leader Diane Benz, who called out the mindless looting and burning of the Target store and pharmacy where she gets her daughter's medicine, were drowned out by New York Times op-eds explaining how easy to understand these actions are. Is it truly easy to understand why Black business owners should be in tears after the businesses that they spent their life savings on is burned to the ground and then burglarized again while the business owner is being interviewed about the burning? Is it truly easy to understand why Black men are gunned down by other Black men who are trying to loot a jewelry store? According to the same New York Times op-ed, there was no other option than to behave in the way that they did. Surely, there must be other options, even if we assume the story about systemic injustice is true. In this case, many observers either withheld blame entirely, or worse, offered praise for a blameworthy activity, such as the destruction of their own communities. And when the results of these actions are that businesses lose incentive to build grocery stores, to open plants, to invest, which actually happened during the 60s race riots in Detroit and Chicago, they will not say what that reason was. Infants are shot in our streets as bullets fly back and forth between rival gangs. Minor disputes turn into fistfights and fistfights turn into shootouts, and most of us won't say anything about it. The can usually gets kicked down the road and never will a single finger be pointed to the agents to blame them for even part of the outcome. So to recap, there's an inconsistency in most solutions which are offered, because praise is offered, but blame is withheld. Discussions of praise for a good act only make sense if the agent was capable of making meaningful choices. If you can offer praise for accomplishments, you should be able to blame agents for their actions and the resultant consequences. Someone might object, Someone might object that it could be possible for there to be, thank you, sir, morally impaired agents who don't know any better because of their context. Now, this objection is sustained, but I do not think that it exempts any person from praise or blame when the action falls short of morality. When we examine a person's activities, even activities of the past, we readily assume the goodness or badness of an individual act or a larger system, without thinking that some set of antecedent conditions might provide an excuse or an exemption for moral consideration, because we assume that each agent acts for their own reasons. If, as we said before, an agent engages in an activity for his or her own reasons, then the fact that other choices were not available or apparent is inconsequential to his praise or blame. To illustrate this point, let's consider a real historical concrete example. There are some historians in the room, and they'll tell you if I'm lying. An examination of the historical record reveals the reality of slavery in Britain from before the time of the Roman occupation all the way up to the early 5th century Common Era. Prior to this occupation, the British Isles lacked cohesion and consisted of around 30 warring tribes. This, of course, says nothing of the living conditions, which even until the 19th century persisted in the British Isles. Poverty was rampant, land was scarce, and crime was normal among the lower classes, being disenfranchised by the more elite of society. Many of the British Isles would throw their waste openly into the streets. Most of the population had been living in squalor, and as land became scarcer, the enclosure movement began, and many were given the opportunity to try their luck in the New World. Once these largely displaced Brits the predecessors of our nation arrived in the Americas, they were introduced to terrible living conditions, to terrible conditions of travel, and they possessed very little skill. But do any of these facts about the conditions of the occupants of the British Isles give us any reason to think that the later enslavers were somehow less than full moral agents, acting out their prejudices and evil deeds? Even if we can't expect that the slave owner was aware, by way of his particular context, that his actions were morally reprehensible, we can agree that he acted for his own reasons, in his own time, and in a way that makes him ripe for our moral considerations and subsequent condemnation. If we reject this view, we're saying to the survivors of systemic violations of human rights that they had no right to call their captors, their rapists, and their mutilators to the carpet. We say to the small Negro girl from one of the slave accounts that I've researched, who had her back cut into strings with flesh worn from her limbs, that she should be more considerate of her abuser's antecedent conditions, which might have led him to actually believe she was property. If contrarily, we give way to the notion that of excuse by way of antecedent conditions, we open the door for a paradox. Nagel observes the following. If one cannot be responsible for the consequences of one's acts due to factors beyond one's control, or for antecedents of one's acts that are properties of temperament not subject to one's will, or for the circumstances that pose one's moral choices, then how can one be responsible even for the stripped down acts of the will itself, if they are the product of antecedent circumstances outside of the will's control? The area of genuine agency, and therefore legitimate moral judgment, seems to shrink under this scrutiny to an extensionless point. Everything seems to result from the combined influence of factors, antecedent and posterior to action, that are not within the agent's control. Since he cannot be responsible for them, he cannot be responsible for their results. So to recap, yes, your context can limit your available choices. However, the agent in question acts on the available choices meaningfully. The acting agent takes certain actions under consideration before acting. Antecedent conditions. Is the slave master, in your mind, excused by way of his context? I don't think you would say yes. If antecedent conditions excuse an act of a moral agent, we are stuck in a paradox. It seems to me, moving on to our next point, that there exist certain universal standards of morality to which all moral agents can be held to account for. Another success. This seems to suggest that we can hold moral agents to standards universally, as we often do when taking a look at the past, as we did in our slavery example. But if you're still unconvinced about success and morality, it will be helpful to take a look at other groups of people to answer this question about context and standards. When we think back to Black history, what were Black Americans like in the post-slave times? An examination of the historical record reveals that they were people who were highly focused on succeeding, even in the absence of support from their neighbors. Many were highly skilled and worked hard to survive despite the fact that their context was so filled with racism and injustice. Black schools emerged in towns like Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the population of Blacks had been formerly enslaved by Native Americans. At these schools, Black American children nonetheless learned Latin and chemistry. Barbershops, doctor's office, auto mechanics, and law office signs were up and down the streets of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Just 45 minutes from here, a national park exists as a celebration of Allensworth, America's first Black colony. There in Allensworth, the judges were Black, the police officers were Black, the mayor was Black, as were all of the school teachers. Colonel Allen Allensworth, the city's founder, only invited persons to live there who were willing to get married, start a nuclear family, get an education, and were willing to work hard. Or we might look to other people in America for tips on how to govern ourselves best with morality and achieve success in an American context. What are the sort of activities engaged in by white Americans that make them successful? How much do they spend on education, for example? And how does that explain their outcomes? Or we might take a cue from the Japanese or Chinese Americans, which I learned from Dr. Kincaid's class, who came here during the gold rush, when they were excluded from sending their kids to white schools or forced into segregated communities. They responded by building Chinatowns across the nation, where they would flourish economically, even with the dismal record of political representation. Or we might look to the West Indian immigrants who have been studied extensively by sociologists and economists. After having moved to the United States They lived in neighboring communities with native-born Black Americans. These West Indian immigrants have been shown to outperform native-born Black Americans in education and earning, they have lower crime rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is that the West Indians look just like native-born Black Americans and would seemingly be subject to the same level of racism and discrimination, yet they do better than native-born Black Americans in all of these areas. I think that all of these communities provide a lesson to Black America, mostly because they seem to believe that they're moral agents whose actions will result in either success or failure, and they govern themselves accordingly. So to recap here, I think we need to take a look at the past. We need to take a look at our neighbors, and we can even look closer at other disenfranchised communities. How have other disenfranchised and formerly enslaved persons risen to the occasion? If moral agency, now we finally move to our second premise, if moral agency and personal responsibility are required for self-actualization, praise, and blame, then it is necessary to identify the sources that undermine moral agency and personal responsibility, sources of good for human beings, and to pursue the best paths for maximizing these good. That seems to follow without the need for much defense, as does premise 3. So we must identify sources which undermine these goods for human beings and pursue the best paths for maximizing. Also seems to follow necessarily. Fourth premise. Any solution to Black American issues, if the solution undercuts moral agency and personal responsibility, there are strong reasons to reject it. And if a solution enhances moral agency and personal responsibility, there are good reasons to adopt that solution. Given what we've discovered so far, it seems that the full moral and social agency of Black Americans must be affirmed if you truly want Black Americans to succeed. There are certain approaches that seem to undermine this idea of moral agency and personal responsibility. If that's true, these approaches should be discarded in favor of one which enhances them. Most of the conversations that we have today regarding race has Black people believing that racism will necessarily stop your forward progress. Such an idea has actually had the unintended consequence of having Black Americans decide not to try to succeed at all because of this idea. This, therefore, destroys agency because it is a teaching that determinism means your choices are not meaningful and that they won't result in a desired outcome. Furthermore, many Black Americans believe that the worst thing to be in the world is a racist. So we spend time talking about Karens in a dog park and more time than we do about the destruction gangs have in our own communities. We do not spend time talking about how the leading cause of death for an African-American male aged 15 to 34 is homicide, or how over 90% of the time the killer will be someone who looks just like him. We spend little to no time talking about how crime is incentivized in our communities through our music or our imitation of it. We do not speak about the fact that we can reduce our chances of poverty by getting an education. We do not often speak about the multiple racist cults that have erupted and are growing, teaching the same sort of supremacy that we repudiate in white communities. And while our children continue to underperform in schools and there's a disparity in parental educational involvement, spending on education, etc., we spend most of our time talking about microaggressions of passersby in class. So I think that one of the undermining things there is an idolization of racism to such a degree that it teaches Black Americans that the worst thing to be is a racist. An overemphasis on racism teaches Black Americans to avoid the biggest problems. And an overemphasis on racism teaches Black Americans that racism is a necessary barrier to success when it is not. I likewise think that many progressivist approaches and political intervention undermines moral agency and personal responsibility. Modern liberalism and progressivism are themselves poisonous for Black Americans, as the proponents of these views often engage in wholesale lying or omission so that the issues are not addressed, undercutting the outcomes necessary for Black excellence. As one author shows, Many issues in the Black community are underreported, if they're reported at all, that would otherwise illustrate the problems in our community that actually need addressing. As noted before, it is often the awareness of an issue that allows for access to moral knowledge. Even those who might be moved to speak out on various pressing issues have been deprived of such an opportunity. These actions are, I think, motivated by certain modern liberal and progressivism in the insistence that there must be an entirely separate set of standards to which no one can offer judgment or call a person out for underperformance. These actions have, I think, been motivated in large part by the idolization of extreme multiculturalism, which does seek to correct the history of colonialism in the Western world. This overcorrection, however, has resulted in an overemphasis of the particulars that overlooks the collective humanity shared by all of our species and the lessons that we can learn from one another ethically and economically. So to recap, progressive policies seem to destroy self-actualization by transferring power from an individual to a state, that government solutions are pitched as superior to grassroots changes. Leaders are continually finding new problems to solve, that this often fails to recognize any activity which Blacks should engage in to change their own circumstances. That what's often ignored are disparate activities, focusing only on disparate outcomes. And an overemphasis on multiculturalism destroys human universality. I think, as I've argued here, that it is enhanced by conservatism. What makes conservatism particularly effective as an alternative are the assumptions of the conservative ideology. Now, when I say conservative, I do not mean to suggest alignment with any particular Western political party. One does not need to, you can all read the side of relief. You don't need to register as a Republican to be a conservative. Many conservatives are libertarian, and historically, as Dr. Kincaid would tell you, many have been Democrats. Likewise, I do not have in mind the situational conservative, which often arises only in response to some position put forth by the opposing side without considering the merits of the actual argument. Conservatism as a political ideology has a range of meanings and applications, so let me define what I mean here. For the purposes of this paper, I mean autonomous conservatism. Autonomous conservatism has two major tenets from which many other tenets flow. First, autonomous conservatism holds that human beings are not by nature good. Second, this version of conservatism holds that we must be skeptical of our capacity to perfect our world due to the limits of human reason. From these two tenets, various themes flow. Conservatives believe that societies must be ordered so that evil is restrained, but not so constructed so as to render freedom an illusion. This freedom must be ordered towards constructive ends. Autonomous conservatism is opposed to the sort of hyper-individualism of modern liberalism and situational conservatism because it views communities and ordered societies as integral in the shaping of upstanding and useful persons. Autonomous conservatism offers a promising alternative to other approaches because it allows for the presence of a less than perfect world and people who are less than perfect. Conservatism does not require a rejection of race or racism as causes for some disparity. Rather, it can be one of many barriers which exist. However, rather than seeking to spend endless time pushing for some utopian society, conservatives see the proper response to be one of caution to widespread and sweeping change, preferring to preserve a consistency in societal norms unless there is good reason to change them and good evidence. Conservatism can therefore offer a consistent set of moral standards that is not opposed to change, while also preserving a consistency that allows for members to participate in situationally conducive activities. Furthermore, conservatism welcomes a traditional distrust of government that is often found among Black Americans. On the conservative view, power is a zero-sum game. So anytime power is transferred to the state, it must necessarily be taken from the people. For Black Americans, conservatism would be of particular use as we're often faced with problems, usually followed by some solution being offered from the government. In doing so, the Black American can expect, on this view, to lose rights and power. On the conservative idea, Walter Williams would say that we can't look to white people in Washington for the solution. It's a Black thing. The conservative mindset asks, therefore, for Black Americans to be fully available for moral consideration and subject to consistent standards. Consequently, Praise and blame can and are assigned based on how an agent acts and the outcomes of those actions. We therefore do not need to seek government solutions for problems that we can fix ourselves. We are free to work within the American system, assuming that it provides for moral knowledge and operational progress. It seems to me that many Black Americans of the past and today already have these ideas, given the mindset that followed them out of slavery and to present. Contrary to some constructors of history, Black Americans of the past did not believe that the legacy of slavery and racial injustice meant that they could not succeed. On the contrary, segregated and enslaved Blacks and Blacks pulled themselves up without a boot, rather than by their bootstraps. Conservative-minded persons like Colonel Allen Allensworth collected segregated Blacks from the Los Angeles area who valued marriage, education, and self-sufficiency to start the first all-Black city, Allensworth, California. He required that all comers participate in, that all comers value patriarchal headship, a nuclear family, the Christian faith, and heavy concern for a moral lifestyle. Elsewhere, familiar communities like the so-called Black Wall Street thrived amidst segregation. Many of the Blacks who built Black Wall Street arrived in Oklahoma as slaves to Native Americans, or were their descendants during the Trail of Tears. When Blacks were excluded from participation in the larger community, they built a budding community where barbershops, doctors' offices, bakeries, movie theaters, auto mechanics, and more thrived. Students in the community learned Latin and physics or visited the local all-Black library. What we usually hear regarding Black Wall Street are the race riots which began and saw this community set ablaze. Very little is said today of the resilience of that community that saw many of the city's businesses and homes rebuilt in just a few months, under 6 months actually. The aforementioned values are the embodiment of the conservative ideal, as they emphasize the need for solutions to community-based problems with or without a change in the larger societal structure that does recognize the issues of their time. Nevertheless, these more conservative-minded Blacks avoided Acadia and decided that there were things that they could do to upgrade their standing, even if they would not be accepted by the majority. It is this mindset that I believe has been abandoned by many in Black America, seeking instead to wait until white America solves its problem before we can even try. Those of us who have thought this way or are encouraged in this thinking, or encourage this sort of thinking, give many Black Americans a reason to throw their hands up and refuse to try at all. Conservatism also has a balance of proper trust and order, a balance of proper order and government, while also being skeptical, an attitude that we welcome in the Black community. The high view of order and the proper place for government means we can address the issues of crime that's rampant in our communities. It also means that we can continue to be distrustful of government and skeptical of their motives. The conservative idea necessarily entails, because of its tenets, that you are responsible for the outcome of your life. The conservative mindset teaches implicitly and explicitly that life sucks, but that you must take hold of your life anyway. One Black conservative put it this way: Negroes must earn their way to higher achievement. They can't get it by throwing rocks, preaching anarchy, or making demands that go beyond reason. The man who wrote those words was the first Black Supreme Court Justice, Mr. Thurgood Marshall. He was a man who not only fought the Jim Crow laws and desegregation of schools successfully at the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall was a man who lived through and suffered the effects of racism in America. But Thurgood Marshall is just one example of a conservative Black American who gives us sufficient reason to think that conservatism is valuable for Black Americans. To recap, we recognize that there's multiple types of conservatives. I've argued here for autonomous conservatism, that the Black American experience in the United States was already conservative. It's been up by your bootstraps, but without a boot. We've learned that conservatism is not equal to registering for the Republican Party. Conservatives can be in any political party or without one. We learned that successful Blacks practice it without knowing it, and that the basic tenets are that human nature is not inherently good, the world will never be perfect, but that you have a duty, does not entail loving government or forgetting the past bad acts, order is necessary, and that communities provide goods for individuals to live good and flourishing lives. And the results is that the world should be structured to restrain evil, freedom should be enhanced for flourishing, community has responsibility to create good solutions. The power to change your circumstances is in your hands. And so for the reasons outlined, I believe that Black Americans should adopt conservatism. Thank you.